She slept in a 10 by 15-foot storage space off Jackson Avenue behind an old 24-hour laundromat, worked the overnight loading dock at a riverfront warehouse she had to walk to in the dark, and woke her 2 children every morning at 5:40 so they could disappear before anyone saw them leave. The unit had no windows, no ventilation beyond the narrow gap beneath the roll-up metal door, and no light except for a small battery-powered LED strip stuck to the bare cinderblock wall. Her body had stopped needing an alarm clock months ago. It simply opened its eyes at 4:15 every morning, swung its legs off the thin air mattress, and placed its bare feet onto the concrete floor with the quiet precision of a routine memorized so deeply that thought was no longer required. Beside her, 10-year-old Malik and 6-year-old Maya lay wrapped under a clean quilted blanket, sleeping with their arms tucked close to their chests in the stillness of an industrial corridor that smelled like wet asphalt, river mud, and diesel exhaust. He owned 85 commercial complexes across 9 states, had not personally walked through an individual storage facility since his firm crossed $400 million in assets, and was being driven to a neglected property in Memphis on a humid Thursday morning in October to approve a demolition plan. Marcus Sterling was 52 years old, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit his tall frame perfectly. His silvering hair brushed neatly back as he looked down at his iPad screen in the back seat of a black sedan. Facility 38 was listed on page 7 of an underperforming asset report prepared by his chief operating officer. 40 storage units built in 1982, an occupancy rate sitting at 64%, and revenue per square foot that lagged 14% behind the corporate average. To him, square footage was either generating maximum return or wasting capital. A property that underperformed was not a physical place of human effort. It was a mathematical error that required immediate resolution. Inside the locked room off Jackson Avenue, Naya clicked on a small pocket flashlight and moved the thin beam across the space in the exact same sequence she used every morning. The light touched 3 plastic storage bins lined along the left wall, each labeled in her neat handwriting on masking tape: Malik School, Maya School, Nia Work. It touched the blue cooler in the corner that served as pantry and refrigerator, holding a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of white bread, and 2 bottles of water. Beside the cooler sat an old cotton rag and a spray bottle filled with a diluted mixture of cheap lemon-bleach and water, bought with coupons at Dollar General. She mopped the raw concrete floor every morning before her children stirred, scrubbing away the dust until the room smelled clean, sharp, and sterile. The bleach clung to the walls, to her hands, and to her clothes in a way she no longer noticed, but it was the smell of a space kept spotless by a mother who knew that the distance between a sanctuary and a condemned cell was measured in exactly this kind of invisible effort. She reached for the rusted Old Colony tea tin, hidden behind the bleach bottle, and opened it slowly. Inside were folded bills and a handful of silver coins. She counted them carefully, the way a person counts the remaining barrier between eating and going hungry. $16.50 remained to her name. That was what was left after paying Pavan $175 in cash on the first of the month to Terrence, the elderly desk manager, who handed her a paper receipt without asking why her boots were covered in warehouse mud at dawn. The money came from her night shift at the logistics dock near the Mississippi River. She loaded heavy wooden pallets from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, 6 nights a week, earning $11.85 an hour. She walked the 1.3 miles to work and walked back in the dark because the city bus did not run at those hours. And she could not afford a single wasted dollar. She knew every unlit stretch along the service road, every broken streetlight, and every shadow along the fence lines. She put the money back, closed the tin, and placed it beside the spray bottle. At 5:40, she knelt on the concrete and placed her hand firmly on Malik's shoulder, then on Maya's. She did not speak. She used a specific, gentle pressure they had practiced for months. They woke instantly, without a sound. They dressed in the dark, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that every minute before 6:15 mattered because at 6:15, Terrence opened the front gates, and no one could see them leave. Malik was 10 years old, and he understood the rules better than a 10-year-old ever should. When children at school asked where he lived, he named Jackson Avenue with the rehearsed ease of a boy who had studied a red brick house with a chain-link fence along his morning walk until he could describe its porch and yard without hesitating. His second rule was to hold his sister Maya's hand at every intersection between the facility and Booker T. Washington Elementary. In the front pocket of his backpack, he carried a piece of construction paper folded into quarters, soft, and worn along the creases from being handled hundreds of times. On it, he had drawn a map in dark graphite pencil. A single line connected a box labeled us to a box labeled school. Exactly 0.3 miles, a 6-minute walk, 2 crosswalks. Along the line, he had drawn small circles with precise labels. Laundromat, chairs inside if it rains. ATM lobby, covered awning. 7-Eleven, bathroom access. It was a 10-year-old's survival manual, kept close to his chest like a compass. At 6 o'clock, Nia led her children out through the side access gate along the back fence where the security camera had been broken for months. They sat on a low concrete step behind the building, and she handed them each a granola bar and a small bottle of water. To anyone driving past on Jackson Avenue, they looked like a mother sitting outside with her children, waiting early for the school doors to open. You would not have seen the locked room behind the laundromat. Children do not measure poverty in financial terms. They measure it in the geometry of their routine. How far the walk is, which doors stay open, which sidewalks offer shade, and which safe spots remain along the route. Malik checked his map, put the wrapper in his bag so he left no evidence behind, took Maya's hand, and began walking. Nia stood on the step, watching them go, holding her breath, until they turned the corner past the laundromat and disappeared from view. She stood there for 30 extra seconds after they were gone, the way she did every single morning. Not because she could still see them, but because those 30 seconds were the last moment of peace she had before the day took over. And the next 14 hours became about surviving until tomorrow. Then she went back inside, pulled the heavy roll-up metal door down, and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark. She had 4 hours before her morning cleaning shift began at a nearby clinic, and she needed to rest. The room was quiet, the smell of lemon-bleach was familiar, the tin box was where it always was, and the system was holding. The system was holding, and for now, that had to be enough. Across town, the black sedan carrying Marcus Sterling turned onto Jackson Avenue. The glass towers of downtown Memphis gave way to industrial warehouses, tire shops, pawn stores with iron bars on the windows, and low concrete commercial strips. Marcus looked out the tinted window at Facility 38, a low cinder-block building with rusted roof gutters and a faded sign. He saw 40 units generating 14% below average revenue on land that was worth millions cleared. He saw an equation on a spreadsheet that needed to be closed. He did not know that inside Unit 14B, a woman was sleeping on an air mattress after working a 6-hour loading dock shift. He did not know 2 children walked to school holding hands using a pencil map drawn by a 10-year-old boy. He knew none of this. He was about to. Terrence was waiting near the front office when the black sedan pulled into the cracked gravel lot. He was 62 years old, his shoulders slightly rounded from decades of physical labor, his gray hair cut close to his scalp. He had managed Facility 38 for 14 years, surviving 3 corporate mergers and 4 regional directors. He knew every gate code that stuck in the humidity, every section of iron fencing that rusted after heavy rains, and every tenant who paid on time. He had known about Unit 14B for 7 months. He had made a decision about it during the second week, and he had not questioned that decision once. Not even now, as a man in a tailor-made suit stepped out of the back seat, into the humid morning air. Marcus Sterling adjusted his dark jacket as the heat hit him. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet asphalt, river silt, and diesel exhaust from the nearby highway. He shook Terrence's hand with a brief, firm grip that signaled he had a schedule to keep and viewed this walkthrough as a necessary task before authorizing the demolition papers. They walked along the concrete aisles between the long cinderblock buildings. Marcus asked quick, precise questions about occupancy rates, deferred maintenance costs, and delinquent accounts. Terrence answered in short, even sentences, keeping his hands at his sides, his face showing nothing of the thoughts running through his mind. When they reached row B, Marcus pulled up the digital asset ledger on his phone. His thumb scrolled past a line item. Unit 14B, Nia Vance. Current status active. Monthly rate $175. Cash payment recorded on the 1st. The entry was just one data point among 40, carrying no more weight than any other number on the glowing screen. They stopped in front of the metal door. Marcus looked down at the concrete walkway. Every other unit in row B had a thin layer of fine gray dust and dry leaves blown in by the wind. The walkway directly in front of 14B was completely clean, swept bare and scrubbed so thoroughly that the pale aggregate in the concrete showed through. The door was secured with a silver combination padlock instead of the standard brass model issued by the company. Marcus pointed at it with a manicured finger. This tenant replaced the lock. Terrence nodded slowly. She bought her own, sir. Said she wanted something sturdier. Marcus looked closer at the base of the metal door where the heavy rubber weather seal met the ground. A faint white crust ran along the edge, dried soap residue. Someone had scrubbed the outside of the doorframe, the part visible to the alleyway. I need to inspect the interior, Marcus said, his voice flat. Policy allows access for structural evaluation prior to property disposition. Terrence stood still for 2 seconds. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small ring of keys, and dialed the 3-digit combination from memory. He had kept the code written on an index card in his desk drawer for 7 months, and had never once opened the lock without her standing beside him. The latch clicked open. Terrence pulled the heavy metal door upward, its rollers rattling loudly against the steel tracks as it slid into the ceiling. The first thing that hit Marcus was not dust or the stale musk of cardboard boxes. It was the sharp, unmistakable scent of lemon-bleach and pine cleaner. The interior of the 10 by 15-foot room was completely lit by the white morning light, streaming in from the open door. It was not a storage room. It was an impeccably organized sanctuary built inside concrete walls. Along the left wall, an air mattress stood deflated and neatly folded, wrapped tightly in a clean-fit sheet with 2 small pillows stacked on top. One pillow had a faded bear print on the cotton fabric. Behind the mattress, 3 blue plastic storage bins were stacked against the cinder block, each labeled with white masking tape and crisp black handwriting. Malik School, Maya School, Nia Work. In the far corner sat the blue cooler, its surface wiped clean. Beside it lay a box of saltine crackers, a jar of peanut butter with the lid screwed shut, and 2 bottles of water. Beneath a small battery-powered light strip stuck to the wall rested 2 children's workbooks, a pencil, and a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web from the Memphis Public Library. Marcus stepped across the threshold, his polished leather shoes making a sharp sound on the clean concrete. He stopped in the center of the space. The sheer order of the room created a strange, heavy quiet. His eyes moved from the labeled storage bins to the library book, trying to reconcile the cold spreadsheet numbers in his hand with the physical reality standing before him. His company reported 64% occupancy. Measuring this space as underperforming square footage that generated a 14% loss. The math on his screen had not told him that a mother was raising 2 children behind a metal roll-up door 0.3 miles from a public elementary school. His eyes caught a small piece of folded construction paper lying on the floor beside the folded mattress. He knelt down, picked it up, and unfolded it with care. It was the pencil map drawn by Malik. He looked at the uneven line drawn from us to school. He looked at the careful circles marking the laundromat, the ATM lobby, and the convenience store. At the top of the paper, the boy had written the words, 6 minutes, 2 crossings. Marcus held the paper in his hands, his fingers touching the soft, worn creases. A strange tightness formed in his chest, a sensation he had not felt in decades, pressing upward against his ribs with uncomfortable weight. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice low, his back still turned toward the door. Terrence stood outside in the sunlight, his arms folded across his chest. 7 months, sir. Marcus stood up slowly, keeping the paper in his hands. 7 months. And you knew? Terrence looked straight at him, his face unreadable. I knew after the second week. Neither man spoke for a long time. The faint hum of traffic on Jackson Avenue drifted through the warm morning air. Then came the sound of footsteps on the gravel walkway outside. Quick, light, and deliberate. A woman walked into the opening of the unit, holding a brown paper grocery bag containing a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. She was wearing her dark work trousers, scuffed work boots, and a plain, dark jacket. Her dark brown face went rigid the moment she saw the opened metal door, the 2 men standing at her threshold, and the folded piece of construction paper in Marcus Sterling's hand. She did not drop the bag. She did not cry out. She did not take a step backward. Her posture instantly shifted into a stance of absolute defense, her shoulders locking tight, her chin lifting with an unyielding, fierce calm. She looked from Terrence to Marcus, reading his tailored navy suit, his polished shoes, and his posture with rapid, calculating precision. She knew instantly who he was. He was the owner of the walls. He was the authority that could unravel every thread of the fragile safety she had built for her children over 7 long months. I will have everything packed and out by Friday evening, Nia said. Her voice was flat, level, and entirely devoid of emotion, delivered with the mechanical clarity of a sentence she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times while walking the dark roads home from the riverfront dock. You do not need to call anyone. I will leave the floor clean. Marcus looked at her, his eyes taking in her slender frame, the faint purple shadows under her eyes, and the absolute lack of fear or desperation in her stance. What he saw was not panic. It was a wall of pure, unbroken dignity. He set the paper map down on the plastic bin marked Malik's school and took a step back toward the alleyway, removing himself from her space. Where are the children right now? Marcus asked softly. Naya's eyes narrowed, her voice hardening instantly, dropping an octave into a protective growl. They are at school. And they have nothing to do with this conversation. Marcus stepped fully out of the doorway, moving back 3 complete paces until his heels rested on the gravel edge of the walkway under the humid morning sky. He raised both hands slightly, palms open and visible, yielding the threshold to her. Nia watched his feet move. Her body remained braced, her knuckles white where she gripped the brown paper grocery bag, her eyes tracking every inch of space he placed between himself and her children's belongings. Terrence stood 5 feet away, against the corrugated metal wall of Unit 14A, his hands folded over his belt, his weathered face settled into a quiet, watchful silence. I am not here to call the authorities, Miss Vance, Marcus said, his voice measured and low, stripping away the sharp corporate tone he used in boardroom negotiations. And I am not here to throw your belongings onto the street. Nia did not soften her stance. She stepped into the unit, set the grocery bag onto the blue cooler beside the loaf of bread, and turned back around to face him from the doorway. She stood framed by the cinderblock walls, her boots planted firmly on the scrubbed concrete floor. You do not need to make promises to make this easier for yourself, sir. I know the lease rules. I know the city codes. I have 3 days before my next shift rotation, and I will have my children and our bins out of this facility by Friday. Marcus looked at the rusted Old Colony tea tin sitting beside the bleach bottle, then back at her face. There are $16.50 in that tin. I counted it when I picked up the paper map. Nia's jaw tightened. A sharp, icy spark flared in her dark eyes, not of embarrassment, but of deep, offended pride. Then you know I owe no back rent. Terrence has my receipt for September, paid in cash on the 1st. Every dollar I earn comes from 6 nights a week at the Pickford dock, and every dollar goes toward keeping my children fed, clean, and clothed. $16 is not a margin, Marcus said quietly. $16 is an emergency waiting to happen. You are living in a 10 by 15 foot room with no windows, no running water, and no ventilation, working 2 shifts on 4 hours of sleep. Nia stepped forward until her toes reached the edge of the metal door track. She looked down at his custom navy suit, his spotless leather shoes, and his silver watch, then raised her eyes to meet his gaze directly. Do not speak to me about margin, Mr. Sterling. You see a metal box because you own 85 complexes across 9 states, and you look at life through a digital ledger. I see a door that locks from the inside. I see a dry floor where my daughter does not wake up coughing from damp carpet. And I see a room where no stranger can walk in at 2 in the morning to hurt my family. The words cut through the warm morning air with the clean, sharp edge of an axe blade. Marcus did not break eye contact. He felt the weight of her history behind the sentence, the implicit, brutal reality of domestic shelters that separated older boys from their mothers, of landlords who evicted victims of violence rather than deal with police calls, and of a system that demanded poor women prove their worthiness before granting them a safe place to sleep. There are cheaper units further south in Whitehaven, Marcus said, keeping his tone analytical, searching for the underlying logic of her choices. And there are residential efficiency apartments near the interstate for $400 a month. Why this facility? Why Jackson Avenue? Nia looked out across the gravel lot toward the tree line along the avenue. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek sympathy. She spoke with the flat, unyielding clarity of an arithmetic proof. Because the bus from Whitehaven does not run at 4 in the morning when my dock shift ends. If I lived in Whitehaven, I would have to walk 4 miles in the dark along an unlit highway to get back to my children before dawn. And because the efficiency apartments near the interstate require a background check, 2 months of deposit, and a credit score that was destroyed when my ex-husband put my name on 3 unpaid emergency room bills. She turned her gaze back to Marcus, her eyes fierce and unwavering. I looked at 14 storage properties in this city. 6 were in neighborhoods where a woman walking alone at midnight gets followed. 3 had no public restroom within a 5-minute walk for a 6-year-old child. 2 had managers who asked too many personal questions. This was the only place that met every single calculation. She pointed a thin, calloused finger toward the east, down the long stretch of Jackson Avenue where the morning sun was beginning to burn through the river haze. I did not choose a windowless storage room to live in, Mr. Sterling, Nia said, her voice dropping into a deep, steely resonance that echoed off the cinder block walls. I chose the shortest distance to the school that was teaching my son to read. The sentence hung in the humid air between them, absolute and immovable. Marcus stood completely still on the gravel walkway. The words entered his mind not as an emotional appeal, but as a staggering revelation of human engineering. He had spent 30 years optimizing commercial real estate, calculating transit corridors, supply chain logistics, and spatial efficiency, down to the quarter inch. Yet standing before him was a mother who had designed a masterwork of physical survival around the specific educational needs of her 10-year-old child, utilizing a 10 by 15-foot box as her strategic base of operations. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and opened it. He extracted a crisp stack of $100 bills, $5,000 in cash, and held it out toward her. Take this. It will cover a security deposit and 3 months of rent at a proper apartment downtown. You can move out today. Nia looked at the green paper in his hand. Her face did not soften. Her expression hardened into an impenetrable wall of cold refusal. She folded her arms tightly across her chest and took a half-step backward into her unit. "I am not a charity case, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "I do not take handouts from men in suits who walk into my space uninvited. I earn my living. I pay my rent. If you want me out of this unit, give me my 3 days' notice according to the contract, and I will pack my bins and leave on my own feet." Marcus looked at the cash in his hand, then at her unbending frame. He realized instantly that offering her unearned money was an insult to her sacrifice. It treated her 7 months of heroic discipline as a problem that could be swept away with a checkbook, erasing the dignity she had fought with her blood and sweat to maintain. He slowly folded the bills, placed them back into his pocket, and closed his wallet. He looked down at Malik's pencil map resting on the plastic bin inside the unit. He looked at the careful labels marking the safe spots along the route to Washington Elementary. "I have an opening in our Regional Operations Division," Marcus said, his voice shifting from sympathy to professional evaluation. "We are restructuring our property maintenance and site logistics teams for our North Memphis locations. It pays $22 an hour, full benefits, day shifts from 7 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. It requires someone who understands facility management, structural maintenance, and absolute operational discipline." Nia watched his face closely, her eyes searching his expression for hidden motives, calculating the terms of his offer with ruthless scrutiny. "And what about the background check? What about my credit score?" "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Infrastructure," Marcus replied calmly. "I set the hiring criteria for my firm. Your work record at the Pickford dock proves your reliability. Your management of this 10 by 15-foot space proves your organizational capability. You will be evaluated on your performance, nothing else." He paused, looking toward the road where the yellow school buses were beginning to move past the front gate. "And, as for Washington Elementary," Marcus added softly, "Sterling Infrastructure will be establishing an educational grant starting this Friday to fund their after-school literacy and special education tutoring program 5 days a week. Your son will keep his seat in Ms. Waverly's classroom, regardless of where you live in this city." Nia stood in the threshold of Unit 14B, her hands resting on her hips, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. She did not cry. She did not break down, but behind her dark eyes, the rigid, iron fortification she had carried for 7 months shifted slightly, making room for a calculation she had not been able to make in years. The possibility of a future. "I will review the employment contract first," Nia said, her voice steady and firm, "and I start on Monday." She stood in the third-floor administrative corridor of the Sterling Infrastructure Regional Operations Center at 7 o'clock on a sharp November morning, holding a stainless steel clipboard in her right hand. Nia wore a navy work shirt with her name embroidered in white thread above the left pocket, dark blue cargo trousers, and polished steel-toed boots that made a firm, measured sound against the polished terrazzo floor. Her dark braids were pinned back securely into a tight bun. Her face remained set in its familiar mask of calm, watchful discipline, though every nerve in her body was hyper-aware of the subtle glances directed at her by the senior facility supervisors who gathered near the central dispatch desk. The transition from the Pickford loading dock to the corporate infrastructure division had not been seamless. In the break rooms and tool bays, low whispers drifted like dust in the corners. Rumors circulated among the long-tenured staff that Nia Vance had been placed into her coordinator role through an unusual executive directive straight from Marcus Sterling's office, bypassing the standard 3-year internal promotion queue. Colleagues like Greg Vance, a senior field manager with 20 years of service, watched her with cold, skeptical eyes, testing her during morning briefings on obscure drainage codes, pipe schematics, and load-bearing calculations. Nia did not offer explanations. She did not attempt to win their favor through easy conversation or defensive arguments. Instead, she arrived at the regional yard at 6:30 every morning, 30 minutes before her shift officially began, to review every physical work order, material manifest, and site log line by line. 4 nights a week, after finishing her 7 to 3:30 day shift and picking up her children from Washington Elementary, she sat in a row of fluorescent-lit desks at Southwest Tennessee Community College, taking night classes toward her commercial facility management certificate. She studied structural plumbing diagrams and industrial electrical grids by flashlight, while her children completed their homework at the kitchen table of their temporary municipal apartment. The system she had developed to survive inside Unit 14B did not disappear when she stepped into an office building. It transformed into a relentless professional standard. She memorized every mechanical layout across all 42 commercial properties in the North Memphis sector. She knew which sumps backed up during heavy downpours, which emergency generators had slow fuel pumps, and which older cinderblock structures retained moisture along their foundation lines. On a rainy Thursday night in mid-November, 3 weeks after she joined the division, a massive cold front collided with warm air moving up from the Gulf of Mexico, unleashing a torrential deluge across Shelby County. Over 4 inches of rain fell in less than 3 hours, turning Jackson Avenue into a muddy river and straining the municipal storm drainage system past its limits. At 11:45 that night, an emergency alert rattled across every supervisor's phone. The basement level of the Sterling Financial Tower downtown, the central facility housing the corporate server banks, primary power transformers, and off-site data archives, was taking on water. A primary storm culvert along the west wall had ruptured beneath the alleyway, overflowing into the lower mechanical vault at a rate of 400 gallons a minute. The primary electric sump pumps had tripped due to an overload, and the emergency backup diesel pumps were failing to prime because of air trapped in the old intake valves. When Naya arrived at the scene in her service truck at 12:15 in the morning, the basement staging area was in chaotic disarray. Water stood 2 feet deep in the lower staging corridor, rising toward the elevated concrete pads that held the high-voltage switchgear. Greg Vance and 3 senior technicians were standing on a dry access ramp, shouting over the roar of the incoming storm water, while wrestling with a tangled roll of emergency bypass hose that refused to seat against the rusted output flange. The main utility schematics from 1994 are inaccurate, Greg yelled, wiping grease and rain from his eyes as he looked at a damp blueprint spread across a metal tool cabinet. The original municipal line isn't where the drawings say it is. If we can't find the secondary gravity overflow bypass valve within 20 minutes, the water hits the main power bus, and the entire network goes dark. Nia stepped through the water in her heavy rubber boots, her flashlight beam, cutting through the damp darkness of the vault. She walked straight to the wall, ignoring the heated arguments taking place near the ramp. She pressed her hand against the exposed cinder block, feeling the vibrations of the water rushing behind the structural masonry. Her mind moved back to her evening studies, to the hundreds of hours she had spent studying old industrial construction methods in Memphis, and to the pencil-drawn maps her son Malik created every morning. Malik had a rare visual spatial giftedness. He saw structural relationships not as abstract words on a page, but as physical spaces that connected logically. He had drawn the utility corridors of the laundry facility off Jackson Avenue from memory after watching the pipes sweat through the metal walls. She remembered a specific structural detail from an old architectural archive she had reviewed during her first week. On the job, a modified 19th-century brick overflow tunnel that ran parallel to the old rail spur beneath the building foundation, long before the modern concrete culverts were poured over it. The schematic is wrong because it shows the 1994 renovation, Naya said, her voice cutting through the noise with absolute, unshakable authority. She walked over to the cabinet, pushed aside the damp blueprint and pointed directly at a blank gray section of the basement wall, near the emergency diesel generator. The original overflow isn't on the west wall. It's behind the secondary masonry curtain wall on the south elevation. They didn't destroy the old 19th century brick channel when they rebuilt the tower. They walled it off with lightweight cinder block. Greg Vance stared at her, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. That's a load-bearing wall, Vance. If you're wrong, and we breach that masonry without an isolation seal, we flood the entire transformer vault instantly. Nia picked up a 10-pound sledgehammer from the emergency response rack. She looked Greg straight in the eyes, her posture ironclad, her dark eyes flashing with absolute certainty. I worked 6 months in an industrial cinder block room built on 1982 foundations, Greg. I know how hollow block sounds when water is backed up behind it. Give me 2 men with sledgehammers, or watch $6 million worth of server equipment burn out in 15 minutes. Without waiting for his permission, she stepped through the knee-deep water toward the south wall, swung the sledgehammer with her full body weight, and struck the center of a hollow block 3 feet above the floor. The cinder block cracked with a sharp, hollow bang. On her third blow, the outer concrete shell gave way, exposing a dark, arched cavity lined with red 19th century brick. A thick jet of trapped air hissed out of the opening, followed instantly by the sound of standing water rushing down a wide, open gravity channel that led straight out to the river basin. Within 6 minutes, the water level in the basement vault began to drop rapidly, pulling the pressure off the electrical pads and allowing the emergency crews to clear the main sump lines. Greg Vance stood in the receding water, holding his flashlight on the exposed brick channel, then turned to look at Nia. Her navy work shirt was soaked with muddy water, her hands were calloused and black with grease, and her breathing was steady and calm. He slowly wiped his face, stepped across the wet floor, and extended his hand to her. "Nice call, Coordinator Vance," Greg said, his voice quiet, stripped of every trace of doubt or condescension. "That was a damn good call." Nia took his hand and shook it once with a firm, solid grip. "It wasn't a guess, Greg," she said simply. "It was just reading the space." Across the flooded vault, standing near the top of the access ramp under the low glow of the emergency lights, Marcus Sterling stood silently in his rain jacket, having arrived 5 minutes earlier to monitor the crisis. He watched Nia lead the crew through the final cleanup protocol, her voice clear, her instructions precise, her authority recognized without question by every technician in the room. He did not step down to congratulate her. He did not interfere. He simply nodded once to himself in the shadows, turned, and walked back up the stairs into the storm, knowing that the bridge he had offered had been crossed entirely on her own strength. The apartment sat on the second floor of a brick building along the riverfront, 3 miles north of the industrial corridor, off Jackson Avenue. It had 2 bedrooms, a clean kitchen with a working gas stove and a porcelain sink, and a wide living room window that let in the bright golden light of late spring mornings. There were no plastic storage bins lined against the walls. Instead, clothes hung neatly inside wooden closets, and school books rested on a low bookshelf beside a small television set. Nia stood near the kitchen counter on a clear Saturday morning in May, wearing a simple blue linen shirt and trousers, watching her children. Maya sat near the living room window, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring out at the barges moving slowly along the brown waters of the Mississippi River. "Mommy," Maya said, her voice filled with 6-year-old wonder, her finger tapping against the glass. "The room has a window, a real window that opens." Nia did not answer immediately. Her right hand reached out to grasp the edge of the wooden counter, her fingers pressing tight against the smooth surface until her knuckles turned pale. She stood very still, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths, and she did not cry. She held her posture with the same fierce, unbroken dignity she had carried inside the dark storage room, But the tension that had locked her shoulders for 7 long months slowly dissolved into the warm morning air. In the hallway, 10-year-old Malik stepped out of his bedroom holding his backpack. He walked over to the bookshelf, reached into his front pocket, and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was the battery-powered LED light strip that had illuminated Unit 14B during their darkest nights. He set it gently on the top shelf beside Tosh's copy of Charlotte's Web, next to a brand-new box of colored pencils his mother had bought him for his birthday. He looked at the light strip for a long moment, then turned to his mother.
"We don't need to turn it on anymore, do we?"
Nia walked over, placed her palm on her son's shoulder, and pressed down with that same firm, gentle pressure he knew so well. "No, baby. We keep it there so we remember where we walked, but we don't need to turn it on anymore." Malik reached into his pocket once more and pulled out a fresh sheet of white construction paper. He unfolded it slowly on the table. It was a new map drawn in dark lead pencil, but the lines were straight, drawn with a wooden ruler. The starting point on the left was no longer labeled U's. It was written in bold, clear capital letters, *home. The line extended 0.5 miles to *Washington Elementary Arist, marking the local public library, a small park with oak trees, and a community garden along the way. He had left his old survival map. The worn, soft paper with its circles for the laundromat porch and the ATM lobby, folded neatly on the concrete ledge inside Unit 14B on the day they moved out. A quiet testament left behind for anyone who would ever stand in that empty space again. Across the city, inside his corner office on the top floor of the Sterling Financial Tower, Marcus Sterling sat at his mahogany desk, looking out at the morning sky. On the polished wood before him rested a small, tarnished copper key, the key to the small, cold water flat where his mother had raised him 45 years ago. Beside the key lay an official corporate charter document, freshly signed and stamped with the state seal. Following the storm crisis in November and his encounter with Nia Vance, Marcus had fundamentally altered the operational protocol of Sterling Infrastructure Development. Facility 38 was no longer listed for commercial demolition. Instead, 6 underutilized storage complexes across Shelby County had been converted into transitional administrative hubs, in partnership with local housing authorities. Facility managers were no longer instructed to issue immediate eviction notices or call code enforcement when a family was found seeking shelter inside a unit. Instead, they were required to contact a dedicated housing navigator, a trained professional capable of connecting families with emergency housing grants, legal protection, and employment opportunities. Furthermore, Marcus had established a $5 million endowment named the Lorraine Sterling Foundation, named after his mother, who had pressed his school shirts on the hood of a Ford Pinto in church parking lots so he could walk into a classroom looking like he belonged there. The foundation funded 5-day-a-week literacy programs, after-school special education tutoring, and rapid rehousing support for single parents working double shifts to support their children. He had not put his name on the building plaques. He had not issued press releases to celebrate his philanthropy. He understood now that true legacy was not measured in square footage or net operating income, but in the invisible bridges built between human beings, when dignity was honored over profit. That afternoon, Marcus drove himself down Jackson Avenue in his plain sedan, without his driver or his executive staff. He parked outside Facility 38, walked past the front office where Terrence nodded to him in quiet greeting, and walked down row B until he reached Unit 14B. The metal door was rolled up. The interior was completely empty. The raw concrete floor was clean, scrubbed bare, still damp from being mopped one final time by the woman who had lived there. The sharp, sterile scent of lemon-bleach still lingered faintly in the cinder block corners. There were no plastic bins, no air mattress, and no tin box containing $16.50. Marcus stood at the threshold and looked down at the concrete ledge beside the door track. Resting on the gray stone was Malik's original folded pencil map, left behind like a monument to human resilience. He bent down, picked up the paper with careful hands, and unfolded it. He looked at the uneven line connecting ooze to school. He looked at the 6-minute timeline. He looked at the small circles drawn by a 10-year-old boy who had mapped out his family's survival with nothing more than a pencil and a mother's fierce protection. Marcus folded the paper back into quarters, placed it carefully inside his coat pocket next to his mother's copper key, and stood silently in the doorway as the afternoon sun warmed the concrete walkway outside. Nia Vance was never rescued. She had not waited for a benefactor to carry her out of the dark. She had survived 7 brutal months in a windowless metal box through pure discipline, unyielding pride, and an absolute commitment to her children's future. When a door was finally unlocked, she walked through it on her own 2 feet, carrying her family forward with the dignity of a woman who had been building her own foundation all along.